Okay. Was there anyone else that wanted to be able to record through Zoom?
Yes.
Calvin? Anybody else?
Me, please.
Jalen, it's not giving me the option to let you record, so it might be something do that for just about anybody else, but for some reason I can't do that for you.
I have a little record. It says recording up above my picture, so I'm not sure if it is or if it isn't.
Okay, I have that too, so that might be that someone else is already recording, or I mistakenly also hit record on this. So either one. Right, and a bunch of messages in here from you guys. So Brooke. Clayson have the same thing where it's not, I don't have that option. I don't know if it's a couple of you that I don't have that option to allow you to record. So I don't know if the version of Zoom you have, I'm not sure. And I might be recording too, but there's okay. Yeah, allows me to record there, John. Let me quickly pull up the image that seemed to give us so much trouble today. See where that was. Yes. Share my screen here. So that was the picture that a bunch of you couldn't see. The Dura Mater there. So I'm not sure why it was similar size to everything else that for whatever reason wasn't going to load. So I need to give it another try. It wasn't on everyone's quiz. There's a pool of questions. From that pool, you'll get just a random number of those. So you had, I think I had about 50 some questions in there. So you got 30 random questions out of that pool. Brooke, I don't think I'm recording. Other people have recording allowed. I was able to do that for them, so I'm not sure. Our lab today is on our nervous system. The rest of our central nervous system. Let me share my screen. Put everything else out of the way. Sorry, so you may notice my background is looking a little bit different because I am in our lab on campus right now, sitting here by myself. And I wanted to show you guys a couple of different things that I have in here. like this model of the spaces in our brain, the ventricles. So I've got, we're going to look through these slides, but I've also got a few things that, for a lot of these structures, it really helps to see a 3D version of this. I know we're looking at it over the screen, but to see some shape to it, and to for a lot of drawings and pictures, it can be difficult to make out what is the space and what is the structure for a lot of these. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at are these spaces that we have in the brain, which are our ventricles. So this ventricular system, and this is where our cerebrospinal fluid begins, and it flows through these chambers. So we have what are called the first and second ventricles, which are also called the lateral ventricles. So they split the brain into these two sides. So these big horns that we have here of the lateral ventricles, and those flow through what's called the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle, which is right in straight center of the brain, right behind your eyes. And there's a narrow passage, the cerebral aqueduct, that flows down into your fourth ventricle, and then there are openings in that fourth ventricle that flow out around the rest of the brain and the spinal cord from there. There's a frontal view of that. You can see that third ventricle and the lateral ventricles to either side. And there's a fourth ventricle right in front of our brain stem. So there's a couple of views of those. Again, another side view there. And let me switch to my other camera view here. Assuming it's going to work okay. There we go. It was not displaying all that well earlier. Let me cover up that stuff. So here's that model of one more time. Didn't like me moving. Here are those ventricles. Autofocus doesn't want to work here all that well. So here's that third ventricle right here, and our two lateral ventricles to either side. So this is where the cerebrospinal fluid starts at, and it flows through this structure. In the middle, our interventricular foramen. Foramen means an opening. So it's this opening that goes into the third ventricle, this narrow passage in between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum, and then through what's called the cerebral aqueduct into this wider opening called the fourth ventricle. And we'll see these structures, or see these openings, these spaces that exist in the brain a few times here, but in a flat image, it can be very difficult to make out that is a space necessarily. So I wanted to take a look at those first. So there's a view of those. Switch back to our PowerPoint down there. So around the brain on the spinal cord, we saw the meninges last week. And I have a little piece of meninges. Sorry, I got a bunch of tubs here to sort through. Piece of meninges real quick. So the meninges are, as we said, that dense, irregular when we're looking at the dura mater. Take a look at an actual piece here. Here is some of that actual dura mater that we can see. It's very, very thick, about 1 millimeter thick, and you can pull on it pretty hard. It doesn't really move. It doesn't stretch all that much and withstand that stretch in a lot of different directions. This would be adhering. You can see the vessels running through it as well. It has a little fold. This is part of the fold that goes down in between the two hemispheres of the brain. What's called the falx cerebri, which you have on there. So this would be adhering right to the bones of the skull in our cerebrum. You can get a little, we'll take a peek at our couple actual brains here that I've got to take a look at too. So we know that that subcerebrospinal fluid is flowing from our ventricles. This is a cross-sectional view of the brain, our brain stem here, what's called the cerebrum or cerebellum, and our cerebrum up here. So it flows out from those lateral ventricles through our third, this is our fourth ventricle here. And then it goes down through the central canal and around the outsides of the spinal cord, but also through our subarachnoid space here in the meninges and out to those arachnoid villi or granulations that we talked about. So back into the blood, the bluish portion that we have here. Here's a view of where that gets reabsorbed at various points around the brain. So those granulations are going to be where it gets reabsorbed that we saw from last week. And when we look at our brains, or actual brains that we'll take a look at here, most of them have the pia mater, or they all have the pia mater, and some will have portions of the arachnoid mater still on them as well. So it'll look like a kind of a meshwork sitting over the top. These first couple, we'll see a few portions of both of those in there. But this cross-sectional view gives us a lot of information. A couple things that we already have seen. We can see portions of our ventricles. So this right here is our third ventricle. And this is the opening here is our interventricular foramen. And that goes into, behind this thin membrane is our lateral ventricle on either side. And here's our fourth ventricle, with you can see a portion of the cerebral aqueduct right there. This triangle shape of the fourth ventricle is right there. So a couple of spaces that we can see in there. We can see the makeout of our cerebrum up on top, characterized by all those foldings, what are called gyri and sulci. So a gyrus means to twist or to turn, so it's one of the raised portions. Sulcus we saw in our peripheral nervous system, in our or in our spinal cord rather last week, another part of our central nervous system. But a sulcus is that shallow depression. So we have all these gyri and sulci in the cerebrum, much smaller folds that we see present in the cerebellum down here. And then our brainstem here at the base of the skull that goes down into our spinal cord. So that opening at the base of the skull, that foramen magnum, is going to be where the spinal cord starts and the brainstem ends. So a couple of different sections to look at there. And when we look at the cerebrum, it's broken into our different lobes. And these are also going to correspond to the bones that sit over the top of them. So we have our frontal lobe, which is at the front, our parietal lobe, which is the middle of the brain here, our occipital lobe at the back. So the back of your head is the occiput. So that occipital lobe is there at the back. And you can just see a portion of the temporal lobe over here, which is at the side. So your temple, that temporal region, so that temporal lobe is over here, just underneath that. And underneath those is a lobe called the insular lobe, or the insula, is beneath those, the frontal, temporal, and parietal and occipital lobes, or an inner lobe beneath those. So all of these have these large folds, and the outside surface of our brain is all gray matter here of our cerebrum. Within that is our white matter. So just a few millimeters below the surface, we have large amounts of white matter. And we remember the difference. So all of our cell-to-cell communication is occurring on the outside portion called our cerebral cortex. On our cross-sectional view that we have here, we can see a couple of named structures. One, this large sulcus, sometimes listed as a fissure, the parieto-occipital sulcus, that separates our parietal from our occipital. So here's our parietal, here's our occipital lobe. So a large separation there. Running in between our two hemispheres, so the right and the left side of the brain, is a deep sulcus, or a fissure. Running right down the middle is called our longitudinal fissure, running straight through the middle there. And deeper in the brain, we have our tracts of white matter. So this structure right here is a tract of white matter that connects the two hemispheres of the brain, called the corpus callosum. That corpus callosum allows communication between the right and the left side of the brain. So that's our white matter that we have there. So that is considered our higher areas of the brain. So as we go down through the brain, we essentially have less and less complexity of function. So our higher brain functions are all up here in the cerebrum. As we move down from that, we have less complex functions that are located there. Okay. That membrane that we saw earlier is removed, and this is, so we can see our lateral ventricle right here. So the space underneath the corpus callosum is that lateral ventricle. Beneath the lateral ventricle, filling in that space, we have these two walnut-sized structures that are called the thalamus. So those are joined in the center by connecting bands. Here's a model of the brainstem with the thalamus at the top. So this is a little oversized model, but the thalamus in our brains is about the size of a walnut on either side. So these two walnut-sized structures, and the thalamus is an important structure for sensory information. So almost all of the sensory information that comes into your brain goes through that thalamus before we relay it out to other parts of the cerebral hemisphere. So that's at the top of this structure called the diencephalon. So our thalamus, below the thalamus and a little in front of it is a structure called the hypothalamus, one we've mentioned before. And coming off of the hypothalamus, we have a structure called the infundibulum that connects to our pituitary gland. So in most brains, the pituitary gland is not visible because the way it sits in the skull, it doesn't come out when they pull the brain out of the skull. So we'll see a model of what that looks like. I'll show that one really quick here. Here's another model of, color correction there, of our thalamus. Here's our two halves of the thalamus. So the view that we are looking at is similar to that. Doesn't like any background I'm picking here. little better there. So our thalamus here, this would be our hypothalamus right here. So thalamus, hypothalamus. The stalk that we have right here is called the infundibulum. And then our pituitary gland is hanging right off of that infundibulum. So the stalk that runs down from the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus controls all kinds of functions. We talked about body temperature, but this is a major regulator of our sleep-wake cycle and a lot of the hormonal control in your body. Your autonomic nervous system, your fight or flight response is located in there. So a lot of things in that bundle of gray matter in the hypothalamus. And then our pituitary gland is primarily going to be secreting hormones. So that's a structure we'll be talking about later. So the infundibulum hanging off of that. And behind that, again, is our space, is that third ventricle. So the space right here is the third ventricle. The structure, so this number 12 that you see, is where the two halves of the thalamus join together. You can see that little raised area that's right there. So if I go back to our PowerPoint view, there's that hypothalamus again. There's the cut edge of the thalamus that we were looking at. And again, the third ventricle is this depression, this space around it. Okay, we have a couple other notable structures around the thalamus. Behind it is our pineal gland. So this is going to affect things like mood and affects our ability to sleep as well. Okay. Yep, so that third ventricle actually loops around that point where the thalamus connects. So that opening is fairly accurate that I showed you in the model here. The third ventricle does surround that connecting, that isthmus that joins where the thalamus connects at. So our pineal gland is here at the back behind the thalamus. It usually has a darker color to it in a lot of the brains, but it's just this raised lump at the back, right at the back of it. And again, there's that corpus callosum that we mentioned. So our frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. Behind the occipital lobes, when you're trying to figure out which is the front and which is the back of the brain, you should be able to find the bottom by finding the brain stem. So that structure right there that's running straight is our brain stem. We'll talk about the parts of that in a bit. And behind the brain stem is the cerebellum. So this is going to be on the posterior side of the brain stem, so the back of your skull. At the very bottom of that is going to be where the cerebellum is going to be wedged into here. And that cerebellum is essentially, it does mean little brain. It's got a thin layer of gray matter on the outside, and you can see the white matter on the inside has a bit of a tree-like appearance, and that white matter inside there is called the arbor vitae, which literally means the tree of life. So your cerebellum helps you with things like repetitive tasks. So when you start walking and you start getting into that pattern, it's one of our timekeeping areas of the brain as well. So things like pattern recognition in part is via our cerebellum. And that cerebellum sits right in front of, right behind the brainstem. And in between those two, again, is that triangular structure, our fourth ventricle, with the cerebral aqueduct joining the third to the fourth ventricle. So we'll take a look at some of these structures around the brainstem. It'll let me, oops, advance here. we saw, here's another view of that cerebellum. Right there, you can see there's a little darker pineal gland, a little easier to see on that one. And that fourth ventricle is nice and easy to see in that picture as well. And there's our view of superior view of the cerebrum here. So you can see that longitudinal fissure separating the right and the left sides. We're looking at cutting this right down the middle and opening it up is the view that we were just looking at. So here's that frontal lobe, and a named lobe we'll see in a couple of views here, a named structure that we'll see, a sulcus that's separating our frontal lobe from our parietal lobe is this central sulcus. So our central sulcus is separating the frontal from the parietal lobe, and there are named gyri on either side. So the plural of gyrus is gyri. So we have a pre and a post-central gyrus. And functionally, those are very important because that pre-central gyrus is our primary motor cortex. So all of our voluntary movement originates out of that pre-central gyrus. And our post-central gyrus is our somatic sensory cortex. So it's the area of the brain for all of our touch, pressure, temperature, all of that goes to the post-central gyrus for us to be able to sense that. So we'll see those a few more times when we take a look at them. So there's another view of that. If we look at the outside here, you can see our temporal lobe here as well, a little better. So there's that temporal lobe. And there's that central sulcus with our pre and post-central gyri on either side. So in lecture, we'll talk about the functions of each of these areas, so just to give you a little taste of what that is going to look like when we start talking about functions there, but just a little view of those. And let me first come to this view that we saw. So this is our thalamus view and our corpus callosum. So the diencephalon and the brainstem that we see is what we're looking at here. So our hypothalamus, again, the infundibulum and that pituitary gland hanging off of it are right here. Our brainstem is split into these three areas. The base of the brainstem is called the medulla oblongata. The middle portion is called the pons, and the top portion is called the midbrain. So these areas of the brain have some areas of gray matter, this area called the reticular formation that we'll talk about a bit in lecture. But there's a large tracts of white matter that also run through here. So there are tracts that are running from the back of the brainstem here to the cerebellum, that are running up to the cerebrum, and that are running down to the spinal cord. So all those areas are connected by these tracts of white matter that run here through our brainstem. So it's an important area for communication with different parts of the nervous system, and there are some very important basic functions. So our medulla oblongata is referred to as well as our primitive brain. So this is the area of the brain that controls things like your ability to breathe and your ability to control your heart rate and your blood pressure. Have some areas of gray matter that are located down here in the brainstem. So those three areas, the medulla, pons, and the midbrain. There are some tracts of white matter that run off of the back there of our brainstem that form these three different tracts called peduncles. So this is our pons, this lighter green area right here. And the pons has these three areas of white matter, these tracts that run back to the cerebellum. So a superior, middle, and inferior peduncle. Okay, so those three peduncles are located here at the back of the brainstem. So the back portion that we're looking at here. On the back of our midbrain, so the area above that, we also have these raised areas. So in our midbrain in red, the very back of the midbrain has these four raised areas, what are referred to as these little hills, called the colliculi. So we have the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. So the singular of that is a colliculus. And these control a couple of our basic reflexes, one of our visual and auditory reflexes, so turning towards loud sounds or turning your head towards movement, are relayed through these areas of the midbrain. It's right here on the back. So here's our two hemispheres of the thalamus. And below that are these superior and inferior colliculi. So together, those colliculi are called the corpora quadrigemina. So neuroanatomy does not make things simple on you, but corpora means body, quadra means four, and gemina, so Gemini are twins. So it's the bodies of the four twins are what we're looking at here. So together, they're the corpora quadrigemina. The top two are the superior colliculi. The bottom two are the inferior colliculi. So we'll take a look at a frontal view of this as well. So on the front of our diencephalon, below that infundibulum, here's that infundibulum, if we follow that right here, that stalk that the pituitary gland hung off of. Just below that are what are called the mammillary bodies, some areas of gray matter that are sitting here just above the midbrain. So these two raised bumps that we see on the front of the brainstem. To the sides of that, lateral to that, are, so on the back we had the cerebellar peduncles. On the front, we have these cerebral peduncles. So these are white matter tracts that are running up to and down from the cerebrum. These are these white matter tracts on the front of the brainstem. Our pons, again, on the back of these are those cerebellar peduncles that we just saw. And then on the front of the medulla, we have what are called the pyramidal, so meaning pyramid shaped. So they have these little raised bumps that are called the pyramidal tracts, aka just the pyramids. These are tracts of white matter that are here on the front of the brainstem that cross over or decussate right here. So there's an anterior median fissure that separates those. And then to the side of those are another bundle of tracts called the olivary tracts. A couple we'll talk about. Oops. So I wanted to show you a few of those in an actual brain, but also in this model that we have. Here's a nice model, and you can see the two hemispheres of the thalamus up here. Here is our infundibulum right here. And just below that infundibulum is those two raised bumps are the mammillary bodies. To the sides of our mammillary bodies are those cerebral peduncles. These are structures. This is the midbrain that we're looking at right here. We'll talk about what this is in just a few minutes. So our cerebral peduncles here on the front of the midbrain. Just bump my camera again. Doesn't like sitting in the USB connector it's in. So on the back, here's the back of our thalamus again. Doesn't want to focus here. So on the back of the midbrain, here's the back of this midbrain here. We've got these two raised bumps that we can see. So it's cut down on this other side. These two raised bumps that are our superior and inferior colliculi. So together, those would be the corpora quadrigemina with the other two that would be next to it. And then here we can see our superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles on the back of our pons. And the space beneath that, we can see part of our fourth ventricle right there. This is the cerebral aqueduct running down into that fourth ventricle. So a couple of views that we have there, showing our different parts of that. On the front, if we go further down, again, here's our pons. Here are those pyramidal tracts and our anterior median fissure separating those. So those two pyramidal tracts that we see on the front of this portion, which is the medulla oblongata. Okay, so a couple of things to look at there. In our model, we'll take a look at these in our brains as well. Take a look at our first brain here. Just turned around. Something doesn't like to. Okay. We have our brainstem to look at here.
Could you point to the thalamus, please?
Yep, just a second. Let me try to get this focus a bit here. There we go. 1 and 2. Almost got there. Huh? Really close. Here's a very close-up view. So this is that third ventricle. This is what we have joining one portion of the thalamus to the next. So in a cut view like this is the thalamus, and we go into this opening, so that's our interventricular foramen. So the structure beneath the third ventricle is all the thalamus as well. Right? So this is all, the structure here is the thalamus. The space above that structure is the third ventricle. Right? Here's our brainstem, or our midbrain right here. So the front of that would be those cerebral peduncles. What would be on the back? Anybody remember what those four structures were called on the back again?
Corpora, caudula, gemelo.
Almost got it. Corpora quadrigemina, yep. So the superior and inferior colliculi. And those are right behind that cerebral aqueduct right here. Here's the cerebral aqueduct going into our fourth ventricle right here. Here's our cerebellum behind it. Here is the pons. Here is our medulla or medulla oblongata. Okay. So our view there in cross-section of those structures, you can see a number of things. If we go above that, again, we can see our lobes here of the brain. Not sure why suddenly having such trouble focusing. Slightly blurry view at least. Here's our frontal lobe, parietal lobe. There's that parieto-occipital sulcus. And here's our occipital lobe. And we'll take a look at our outside. We can also see temporal lobe here on the side. So this one has the cerebellum removed. There's our temporal to our occipital lobe in the back. So a view of those couple. Let me get one more example of that to look at. This is a brain where the membrane above the ventricle is not here. Try one thing really quick here. See if I can just focus from the controls anywhere. think that'll solve it. We won't all get sick. Trying to look at this.
Real quick, I know we probably don't get much access with the models, but is there any way we could get our own? Like, does a bookstore have those, or do you guys have to specially like order them?
Oh, this brainstem model. The bookstore doesn't have these. I think these ones run usually 80 to 100 bucks. So I'm going to take some additional pictures because these are some pretty good models, but even for a Fairly, this is a pretty inexpensive model, but yeah, none of them come all that cheap.
I think the library might have some. I know they've got the skeleton and a couple other
Skeletons,
things.
they don't have any brain or brainstem models that I'm aware of. It's been a couple years since we went through their collection, but I don't think they had anything besides the bones, really. There was just a couple other things last we checked. Okay, this gives us, everyone can see that now quite a bit better. So there's that corpus callosum. Here's our lateral ventricle under it. So everything beneath that, this is all thalamus that's underneath it. Here's our third ventricle. Space right here is our third ventricle. Here's the midbrain, our pons, and our medulla. And you can see part of the spinal cord right here. It's beneath it. Leave it out. And in a couple of these where the cut is not perfect, you can see the inner portion, the difference in the white and the gray matter in this brain, for example. So there's that white matter that got cut part of the cortex, the gray matter on the outside got cut off. So this is our frontal lobe. On this view, you can see our cerebellum down here. So which side, is this the frontal lobe or is this the frontal lobe in this brain? A or B? Is this frontal A or frontal B?
A.
Yep, A. So the cerebellum again is the back. It's our posterior sides. The occipital lobe will be above that. Hard to see the parieto-occipital sulcus because we have most of, this is what the arachnoid mater looks like. It's that extra film that we've got on this one, that extra layer of tissue sitting over the top of it. So our frontal lobe is out here. A little tough to see. Here's our central sulcus and our pre and post central gyri that we have on either side there. So a couple, just another view to look at our brains. So I'm going to make some images of these as well to share with you guys. A study, the last things in the brain for us to know is off of, you can see from, you'll see them in the brainstem model as well, but are the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So a dreaded part of any neuroanatomy section is keeping track of what all of these do. So in this model, in this picture of the brainstem and in the model that we look at, the first pair of cranial nerves, so we can think of these as just like our peripheral nerves that were coming off of the brainstem, we have these 12 pairs of nerves that primarily are going to be innervating areas of the head and the neck. Right? So all the motor control for the eyes, the face, the mouth, a lot of the neck muscles are motor neurons that are arising from these cranial nerves. And also all of our sensory neurons for our special senses, for hearing, vision, smell, taste, are all going to arise from our cranial nerves as well. So the first cranial nerve is actually not shown on here. We'll come to this view again. But our first cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve. And the olfactory nerve, so this is showing the tract here coming off of it. This is the one that arises the highest. So they're numbered from where they come off of the brain or the brain stem. So the one that comes off the highest is the olfactory bulb, and it runs along the top of the frontal lobe right into the top of your nasal passages. And I'll show a quick view of that too on one of our models. Over to the second view of that. Share. So this is the underside of the frontal lobe. And these are the olfactory tracts that are running out right to the top of your nasal cavity. So an additional view to look at there. That olfactory bulb carries our sense of smell. Optic nerve is cranial nerve number 2. It's carrying our sensory information for vision, so our optic tract. It crosses over just above the two optic nerves cross one another at a structure called the optic chiasm that we'll see in a second. Our third one has a lot of our motor control for the movement of the eye. So the muscles around the eye are controlled in part by the oculomotor nerve. So oculo referring to the region around the eye, and motor referring to movement. So our oculomotor nerve. Our fourth cranial nerve is another one that innervates the muscle, a few muscles around the eye called the trochlear nerve. There's a pulley-shaped muscle. The word trochlea means pulley. So this trochlear nerve innervates that trochlear muscle around the eye. So another one controlling eye movement. And then we get into one of our nerves that has a lot of branches going throughout the face, and that's our trigeminal nerve. So it has 3 main branches that come off of it, of our trigeminal nerve. And there's a view with the skull removed. So we started out up here with cranial nerve number 1, cranial nerve 5. You can see we're down about midway through the pons now, is where that's arising. And it has these 3 branches. You don't need to know the 3 separate branches of it. You can see that it innervates portions of the top of the face, the middle of the face, and the jaw. So a lot of sensory information that's going to run through these trigeminal nerves. So the actually a portion of this maxillary division runs along the top of your mouth from either side. So when you eat ice cream too fast, you can cool down portions of that trigeminal nerve, and you will get what's called referred pain, where the brain doesn't know where that pain came from. So it refers it says you have pain somewhere in this maxillary division. So you eat that cold ice cream and you get an ice cream headache. So along your temple is where it projects some of that pain onto. That's that trigeminal nerve, a couple of divisions there. Our cranial nerve 6 is another one involved in control of the eye, the abducens. That's our 6th one. Our facial nerve, in part, is going to control movement of the face, the cranial nerve 7. There's a couple views of that cranial nerve. Our vestibulocochlear is also called the auditory nerve. It innervates the inner ear. So this is your nerve, the nerve that carries your sensation for hearing and for balance. So now we're towards the bottom of the pons and the top of the medulla. Cranial nerve 9 is our glossopharyngeal. So glossal means the tongue, and the pharynx is the back of the throat. So we're innervating down the back of the throat and down into the neck now with our glossopharyngeal for cranial nerve 9. Cranial nerve 10 is called the vagus nerve. So this is going to be one that we're going to talk about a lot because this is the only cranial nerve that leaves the head or the neck. The word vagus means wanderer. So the vagus nerve actually runs down and it innervates much of our viscera. Most of our visceral organs have vagal innervation. So the vagus nerve runs into things like the heart and the GI tract, down in your reproductive and urinary tracts, all have vagus nerve. And this is one of our primary parasympathetic nerves that we have in the body. So that vagus nerve, we're now a little bit lower into the medulla now. Cranial nerve 11 is our accessory, also called the spinal accessory nerve for 11. And our 12th nerve, so this is the other one we saw last week, the hypoglossal, so beneath the tongue is what the word hypoglossal means. This is part of our motor control of the tongue. So we're going to talk about their functions more in lecture, but identifying those from a couple of different views, including this brainstem view that we had right here. So you can see those. Here's our optic nerve. So again, the olfactory comes off above the brainstem. So our first cranial nerve that we have coming off of the brainstem is the optic nerve. And it crosses this point where the two optic nerves cross is called the optic chiasm. So our optic nerves go into opposite eyes. And then as we go beneath that, again, we can see our oculomotor and our trochlear down to our trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, running out to the ear. And then as we get down to the medulla, we innervate from there down into the neck and out of the body, with our glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. So another view to show those, again, in that model. I'll show you guys pictures of these as well. You can see here's our optic nerve, the optic chiasm, oculomotor. Okay, so again, above the oculomotor would be our olfactory. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is our trigeminal, trochlear above that. And then we run inward to go 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then our hypoglossal here is 12. Okay, so a couple of different views to look at that. So I'll take some pictures and post these on a separate module with some additional pictures of some brains as well. Ideally, this would be a lab where you guys would be able to pick up these models and to poke around a little closer at the brains, but we'll have to look at some images and some drawings to fill in the meanwhile. So questions on any of those structures? I know everything was probably flying by there for you guys.
You said once we start taking lecture, we're gonna do most of the functions, correct? I know we went over some of them with the nerves, but
Yep, so it'll just, for the quiz, it'll strictly be identification for this one. We'll talk about functions of most of these in lecture in the next couple weeks. So Clayson, so the lateral ventricles are actually, would be sitting right above the thalamus. So those are collectively called the lateral ventricles. So I think I might be getting them turned around. I think the right ventricle, the right lateral ventricle is 1 and the left is 2. So those are just known though as the lateral ventricles, or you only need to know them as the lateral ventricles. Right. For keeping track of the order of the cranial nerves, there are a bunch of different mnemonics. As I've said, I always have more trouble learning mnemonics than helping me remember them. But the famous one is on old Olympus towering tops, a Finn and German view some hops. And there's a bunch of filthy ones and things like that with most mnemonic devices if you're looking to keep the order of those straight. But we'll go through as we get into function that'll help you learn them, but that's adding another level of complexity to keeping those structures straight. Right. This week, I'm not going to give you guys another, I think I'm going to put together a post-lab activity for you guys to fill out for some points to give you guys a little bit more time to go through things and something that'll be more repeatable. So I'll put that up tomorrow for you guys to complete. I'll send that out to you. So if nobody else has any questions, we will stop there.
So according to the schedule, our next exam is supposed to be this Friday, but I remember last time you gave us 2 days to take the exam. So for this time, will we have until Sunday night to take the exam, or will
I put this in the announcement that I sent out earlier today. I'm going to move just because I don't want to try to squeeze in and throw in an extra lecture of neurotransmitters at you guys. And I wanted to get a little bit more in before the exam. So we're going to move the exam to next week. So it'll be open next Thursday and Friday.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep. That's on, if you look through the announcement that I sent out earlier.
So it's going to be over chapter 6, or at least most of it?
Everything, so we'll probably get through, we'll finish the neurotransmitters and cover the autonomic nervous system will be the cutoff.
Okay, so there's nothing from previous lectures on there. It's just 6.
It's just going to be what we've talked about, yeah, and so far in chapter 6. So that's all of the neuroanatomy we've talked about so far, all the neurophysiology we've talked about.
Okay, awesome.
Yep.
Can you repeat the lectures again? I'm sorry, what the test will be over?
So it'll be over everything that we'll have covered from chapter 6, all the neurophysiology that we've covered up to this point. And we'll finish neurotransmitters and the autonomic nervous system next week. And then we'll do a little bit on on gross nervous function before we do sensory in chapter 7.
Can we go? Go ahead.
Hello?
Okay, so basically, so lectures 12, 13, and 14 will be part of Thursday's test, right? Or am I getting it wrong?
Say that again?
So will lectures that you posted 12, 13, and 14, will they be on next week's test too as well?
Yep.
Okay.
So all the neural stuff we have covered so far is all in chapter 6. Yep.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question about a few quiz questions from a couple quizzes ago?
You can, yeah.
Okay, one second.
I'm not getting up. I'm just covering these brains because they stink.
Okay, so I'm looking at one of the questions from lecture quiz 3, and it's talking about conduction velocity.
I think there were probably 2 questions that I had the key incorrect. And I went and changed the key, and it was supposed to regrade those, but it doesn't look like it did. So for that one, and there's the graded potential question, or the local potential question, I think, that also didn't get graded correctly. So yeah, it is it should be the largest diameter myelinated axon would be the fastest.
Okay, thought so. And so that other one would be the one that says action potentials are propagated along the axon primarily due to such and such. Is that one?
So the other one is which of the following are properties of local potential?
Oh,
And it's graded, can be positive or negative, decremental, something else in there.
okay. Well, then one more question I kind of want to ask about it's question 2. I don't know if it's the same question 2 on all the quizzes.
Nope, it wouldn't be.
Okay, action potential. It says action potentials are propagated along the axon primarily due to, and I chose the movement of sodium ions by local current, but it says the correct answer is the inactivation of the voltage-gated sodium channel. So could you explain that a little bit?
So, yep. So for propagation to occur, we need to have an area of inactivity behind it. So that inactivation of our sodium channels creates directionality for that current. Or else
Okay, I see.
you would have depolarization going in both directions without that.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Can I share? Sure, that's fine. I don't want to be on somebody's YouTube channel, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, you can do with those recordings what you will. So yeah, if you want to share them, that's fine. Okay, other questions, comments? Make some notes.